Hey guys, welcome to our tutorial for the month of July. In this tutorial, we're going to be talking about brushes. So I'm going to try to explain my workflow with my brushes in this tutorial, and hopefully this is going to help you guys understand brushes a little bit better. It's going to help you be able to use your brushes to their full potential. And this doesn't just apply to my specific custom brush set. This can be applied to any other custom brush set as well. There are some main principles that I want to cover in this video. So in the first part, we're going to be talking about the different brush types, their properties, and some of the concepts that I want you to know. And in the second part, we're going to get into a bit of a demonstration as to how the brushes actually work in a real life painting scenario. Now, we're going to be doing this part of the video in Photoshop, but I'm also going to be covering my Procreate brushes in a separate video. So stay tuned for that. Jumping straight into this topic, okay, there are 4 concepts that I want you to keep in mind about brushes. So the first thing is shape, and shape basically refers to what does your brush look like? What does that tip look like? So it's something like that. And then when you draw a line, this brush looks something like that. And I'm using the line brush here, which has a really nice, soft, flowing shape. Okay, you want to understand the shape of your brush because it gives you an idea of what you're getting into. So here's the No Mercy brush, looks something like that. Use a round brush, looks something like that. Now the shape of a brush can be completely different from another brush, right? You could get something that looks like this, or something that looks like that. So understanding what's the shape of this brush kind of gives you a bit of a preview as to what you're getting into with that brush. All right, that's the first concept that I want you to know. Second one is opacity. So opacity means the level of transparency that's actually going to be visible on a single brush stroke. So when I use the basic round brush in my brush pack here and I put down a brush stroke, there's no opacity right now, but there is a little bit of a fall off towards the edges. But you can see without applying too much pressure, I'm still getting a pretty solid brush stroke. But if I turn on pressure opacity, which is this little button right here in between the opacity slider and the flow slider, if you click on that button, now your brush stroke is going to look a lot more faded if you press lighter, but if you press heavier, you're gonna get that opaque look right back. Pressure opacity basically means the lighter you press, the lighter your stroke's gonna be, and the harder you press, the more solid your stroke is gonna be. This is important because if you're trying to mix colors, okay, so let's say I'm trying to mix a little bit of blue in here and I don't have pressure opacity. Well, now you can see there's going to be a hard edge between my mixes. Whereas if I turn it on, I can achieve a very soft, faded kind of look. Okay, so that's the difference between with pressure opacity and without. Now the third point is control, and this is how well you can convey an idea with clarity with the brush that you're using. So I'm going to use the Line 2.0 brush here, and I'm going to try to draw a basic construction of the human head. And you can see using this brush, I'm having a very easy time conveying this information in a pretty clear way. You know, I'm going pretty fast, so it's a little bit rough, but I can get my idea across really well. Now, if I were to try to do the same thing with a round brush, you're going to see that I lose a little bit of control because I cannot alter the weight of my lines, and it is rather thick. So you see the final drawing here is not nearly as clear. Now, if I were to take something like an airbrush, it's going to be even worse. Now this whole thing is going to look out of focus and you're not going to have any hard edges whatsoever. So this is about the level of control that you have over your brush to be able to create things with a sense of clarity. Now if you want to push it to the extremes, we can take a scatter brush here. Now this brush kind of creates like a randomized scatter on the page, so you don't really have any control over how this thing is going to behave. You press down once, it's going to randomize the scatter. You press down again, it's going to randomize the scatter. You don't know where it's going to end up. So if you were to try to do the same thing with this brush, you know, you're going to have a very hard time conveying that idea. So this is the concept of control. Okay, it's going to come up later. Now the fourth one is texture. Texture is something that I like to think of as like the brunt of the personality of a brush. So if you take a brush like the basic round brush, paint something with it, You know, there's not a whole lot of texture, but this is the personality of that brush. It's just very smooth. It's very straightforward. But if I were to take a brush like the Loose Hatch, okay, now this brush has a very specific kind of personality to it. And if I were to take a brush like one of these sample brushes that I have down here, you can get a very similar effect to this round brush, but just with a whole lot more texture, right? It depends again on what you want to achieve, what kind of look you're going for in your painting, what kind of atmosphere are you aiming for. You could even use the paint sample brush, and once again, we're getting a completely different texture and experience painting with this brush. So texture really is just about the personality of the brush that you're using, and you can use texture brushes to create all kinds of illusions, right? You could use this toothbrush sample here to create a kind of dirty looking effect, right? So if you have like a, let's say like a rock wall or something, or stone surface, this might be really useful for something like that. And if you have, let's say like a really rough, maybe fabric or something, this roller brush might actually be really good for that. So each brush has its own unique personality, its own unique characteristic, and it's shown through the texture. One thing that I always like to keep in mind with textures on my brushes is when I'm painting something, I try not to use too many different textures on that one specific thing, because each texture creates a very unique look, and that unique look is going to draw the attention of the viewer. So if you have too many of them, sometimes you actually lose the focal point of the painting because there are so many different points of interest. So remember to keep it down low enough to a point where you can still convey a certain level of clarity without losing focus of the main subject matter. So that's kind of like the 4 concepts that can help you guys understand how these digital brushes behave. But now we're going to talk about my specific brush category. So I've narrowed down 5 categories that I like to use in almost every single painting. Okay, so that is the line brush, the round brush, the airbrush, the blending brush, and the texture brush. And these categories are flexible. You can interchange the brushes that you use in each and every one of these categories, but they have a very specific purpose. So the line brush, that's going to have a lot of control. It's going to have a lot of clarity. You can use it in areas where you need a clear, defined focal point. So in my case, in my brush pack, that is the Line 2.0 and No Mercy 2.0. These two are my go-to line brushes. Line 2.0 gives you this really nice kind of taper, and you can make some really thin, really solid lines with it. And if you turn on pressure opacity, you can get more of a feeling that's closer to traditional pencil sketching, which I really like about this brush. Now, when you're actually painting something, you could go in with the line brush to create a little bit more sharpness, a little bit more focal clarity. And another brush that I really like to use for my drawings is the No Mercy brush. This brush is really great. It's so simple. There's no taper, there's no opacity. It forces me to simplify my lines, and it creates a very high level of contrast. There's a lot of control. You know exactly what you're putting down. So these are the line brushes that I like to use for Photoshop. In Procreate, I do have some different brushes that I use, which I'll show you guys later on. But for now, these two are kind of like my go-to line brushes. And if you have another brush that kind of tapers like this, has really good line quality, you could by all means use it as your line brush. So the line brush is a brush that has a lot of solid control and clarity. Second one is the round brush, and I use the Round Brush 2.0. This is one of my favorite brushes of all time. It's just, you know, I've experimented with tons of different brushes, and I just keep coming back to this one. It's just so solid for applying colors, especially on portraits. It's just so simple and so straight to the point that I love using this brush. Now, the round brush doesn't have to refer to this specific round brush. The category really covers any kind of brush that has a large surface area that is good for applying large swatches of paint. So really, in this case, in my brushes, you could even use some of these sample brushes, right? Like the paintbrush sample brush that I have right here. It applies a large swatch of paint over a large surface area. You could use this as your round brush if you want your brush strokes or your paintings to have a little bit more of a painterly feel. You could even use the paint sample brush, you know, just something with a lot of surface area that's really good for applying large swatches of color. this is my definition of the round brush. Okay, this is the second category. The third category is the airbrush. Now the airbrush I think is one of the most useful brushes, but it's also one of the brushes that you really want to look out for because you do not want to overuse it in your paintings. If you do, your subject or whatever it is you're doing is going to look out of focus. Things might look muddy. So you really want to control it and limit it to specific areas, which I'm going to show you guys later. So that's the airbrush. I use like just a basic round airbrush in my brush pack, and it works really, really well. So let's move on to number 4. Number 4 is a blending brush. And this is, again, like one of the most important staples in my brush pack. And it doesn't really work on its own, but let's say I have a color here and a lighter color at the bottom, and I want to merge these two together. Well, now I'm going to take this blending brush, and if you look in my brush pack, it's the one with the little finger in the top right corner called blending. If you take this brush and you just gently run over this hard line a couple times, now you've got a nice smooth blend between the two shades. This is a brush that I use a lot for skin, for areas that I need to really smooth out the transition from dark to light. This blending brush is huge, and it also works really well in Procreate. So this is what I've been using in Procreate as well. Moving on to number 5, and that is a texture brush. Usually you're gonna see me using the loose hatch for my textures. I really enjoy the way that this brush looks. You know, it's got so much character, so much life, and it's so sketchy looking. You know, I really like that about it. But there's also things like the halftone brush. You could use that for your textures. The scatter brush, you know, apply some texture. Maybe the toothbrush, right? So these texture brushes I like to save for the very end when I want to do some final touches, because these brushes don't have a whole lot of control. You can't really create things with a high degree of clarity with them, but you can change the texture and the feeling of the surface completely by applying one of these brushes onto that surface. So that's a comprehensive look at the 5 different categories that I've kind of narrowed down for my workflow, for the kinds of brushes that I like to use. As long as you follow the basic principles of control, opacity, clarity, and all that stuff, you can easily switch them out for other brushes. You might have brushes that you like from other custom brush packs. You could switch out this round brush with something that you like to paint with. You could switch out this line brush with something that you like to use. Maybe it's a line brush with a little bit more texture. So that does it for the first part of this video, where I talk about some of the concepts and give you guys a basic overview. In the second part, I'm going to show you guys how these brushes actually come into play in more of like a real life painting scenario. Okay, with that being said, let's move on to part 2. Okay, so the first thing that I want to talk about in this section is drawing portraits. So when you're drawing a portrait, what's the first thing you got to do? You got to lay down a sketch. We're going to use our line brush for that, and you can use you know, if you're using my brushes, you could use Line 2.0 or No Mercy 2.0, whichever one you like a little bit more. What these brushes do is they afford us a lot of control. We know exactly where our lines are going, so that our character, you know, we can draw them with a high degree of accuracy. Doing a sketch for a portrait doesn't have to be exactly like what I've shown here. This is very rigid, this is very in line with my style, but you could also turn on the pressure opacity here for your line brush. You could do something that looks a little bit more traditional, a little bit more, you know, there's a little bit more life to the lines, something like that. You know, you could really play around with what you like, and now you've got all different kinds of variations in the line quality. You might like that a little bit better. Feel free to experiment, switch it out, change it around, but you want to make sure that you're using a brush with a high level of control, a line brush. Okay, so now that we have our sketch, that's when we move into our second phase, which is color blocking, actually coloring and painting and rendering the character. Now in this phase, you generally don't want to use a line brush, because these brushes are very fine and they create detail really well, but if you want to fill out a space, you know, it's just a little bit of extra work for you. What I like to do is I like to switch to the round brush, which in my case is the basic round brush that I use. I like to use it to cover a lot of ground, and usually you're going to see me combine it with the lasso tool, and this basically allows me to find an outline for my portraits, and using the paint bucket I can fill this outline with one specific color that I think matches the skin. Okay, so now having done this, I'm going to lock the transparency of this layer, which makes sure that when I paint on this layer, I don't go outside of what's already there. I cannot paint on the transparent sections of this layer. It's just super useful for saving you a lot of time and not having to worry about the outlines and the edges. But what we're gonna do now is we're gonna take our round brush, and in my case, I'm using an actual round brush, but you could also use something like what I've done before, like the paintbrush sample brush here, and you can apply your shadow values like that. Just make sure that it's something that's big, it's flat, it's gonna cover a lot of ground on your painting. That's going to be your round brush that you're going to go to. So whether or not you choose to use a textured brush like this, or just use a smooth round brush like what I do for a lot of my paintings, is completely up to you and the kind of style and the feeling and atmosphere you want to go for in your painting. So I like to use a basic round brush because it's just kind of a no nonsense kind of brush. You know, it just gets straight to the point. So I would follow the lines of the shadows down, just following the outlines that I see on the face, and I can cut back into the shadow with the original color. Okay, so I think that looks pretty good. So now we can apply with the airbrush, which is the next category of brushes, maybe some local colors on the skin, right? Maybe there's a bit of blush in the cheeks like you see on this image right here. So I'm gonna just apply a little bit of a red, and it just blends so smoothly into the rest of the skin. This is why I like to use the airbrush. It's just easy, you know, I don't need to go back into it and reblend it. It just works on the first go, and it saves me a lot of time. And now you're probably wondering, okay, what do we do about all these hard edges? Well, that's where the next brush category comes in. That's where our blending brush comes into play. So if you just take this brush, run it along the edge of that shadow, now all of a sudden you've got a soft shadow. And if you come down here, run it along the edge a little bit there, and then right here, you've got a fade from hard to soft, even on the cheek here, right? Hard to soft shadow. You can also achieve the same effect with the airbrush. Taking the color that's already there, you can apply the airbrush and create that kind of soft transitional kind of look. Okay, so that's where these brush categories come into play. Now, if I want to apply some, you know, some more vibrant colors, I can use the airbrush to kind of just brush in some of the shadows here, you know, give it a little bit more life, a little bit more character. And now let's move on to the facial features. Okay, so how are you gonna carve out these facial features? Well, it's very simple. For me, I like to go back to the line brush category because they give me a lot of control and clarity. And I like to use this brush, Line 2.0 here. This brush is not as good in Procreate, but we have an alternative. So I'll show you guys that in the second video. But this brush right here, okay, we're gonna take a dark color. We're gonna turn on pressure opacity so that it's a little bit more forgiving. And then I'm gonna just carve in the shape of the eyebrows. And then I can go back into it with the original color of the skin, and you can see now we got a very sharp shape. If you were to try to do the same thing with a round brush, you would actually have a very hard time maintaining that shape. You would have to go back into it many times, and it's not guaranteed that you're gonna be able to get it right. But with a brush that affords you a little bit more control, it's a very easy process. Now going back to the line brush, okay, I'm gonna do the exact same thing for the eyes. Turn on pressure opacity there. I can even do a little bit of coloring, right? Just make the brush size a little bit bigger, and I can color into the eye, carving out that fold in the eye. And you can see there's a lot of clarity to the brush strokes here, right? It's very, very readable. Again, if you were using a round brush or like a flatter paintbrush, it's gonna be hard for you to achieve this level of detail. And this brush is very flexible. You can change the direction of the brush to give it like a different look, and you can follow the outline of the character and add in some rough line art to give your art a little bit more style. And the exact same thing can be applied to the nose, right? So you want to get some of the details down. Well, you can carve out the nostrils, you can carve out the break in the lips. And usually for lips, I like to apply it with a airbrush just to get that soft faded look into the rest of the skin. You know, just give it that color. finding a darker color using the line brush that we have to really just sharpen that up. And usually when I get to this stage of a painting, when I think the rendering looks pretty good, I can move into smaller details. So looking at these highlights on the face here, we can lighten that on our piece as well, right? Turn on pressure opacity using the line brush because we want clarity in small details. The highlight by the nose, a little bit of a highlight on the cheek, and then we can go in with the blending brush to smooth out the soft edges as you need. Right there. And now there's quite a convincing look on the skin. Now you're probably wondering, okay, what do we do for the hair? What kind of brushes should we be using for the hair? And you might be tempted to use a line brush or a brush with a very fine kind of texture on the hair, but I would actually advise against that. If you were to do something, you know, like that right off the bat, you're gonna get a very distracting look that doesn't merge well with the rest of your painting. Instead, what I like to do is I like to take a round brush, and this doesn't have to be the round brush. Once again, it could be any flat painting brush. And I just take the color of the hair and I apply it based on the big shapes that I see, finding the shadow values on the hair like that, and then finding the light values on the hair, and then finding that highlight value on the hair as well, using the same brush this entire time, carving back into the highlights to create that look of that rim of highlights on the hair. And that's how you get an overall convincing look for the big shape of the hair. You never want to focus on the small strands right away. There is a place and a time for that. So once, let's say, we're more comfortable with the rendering of the hair, we can then move into the line brush. Once again, getting a little bit more clarity in our brush strokes. So I can turn on pressure opacity. I can use a line brush, a sharper, clearer line brush to chisel out some of the details, right? So it looks like there's strands, there's little shadow values in the hair, you know, a little bit more visual interest for people to look at. And also thinking about the silhouette, right? So you're looking at stuff like this that kind of comes out of the hair. So we're going to take that and we're going to use the line brush, change the direction of it a little bit to make it look a little bit more natural, and just let it fade into the background, right? Coming off, giving it a look that is really believable, giving it that slightly complex silhouette to the hair. It's all really just an illusion, but we're using this brush because we want the maximum level of clarity in these fine detailed strands. And if you're looking at the very sharp highlights down here, I would turn off pressure opacity and just apply that there so that it's really high contrast. I'm on the nose too. Maybe we could get a little bit on the lips, but again, it's not a very complex process at all. And same thing for the clothing down here. So let's say you want to paint that clothing. Well, I'm going to pick a color, and for clothing, I usually like to use a large version of a line brush because you need to get some of these sharp, jagged edges in your clothing, and sometimes with a round brush, it might be a little bit hard to do that. You know, I would pick a color like that, find the light value, maybe something like that. And then using the line brush and the high level of clarity, we can apply some drop shadow behind the folds in the clothing. We can apply some line art to the actual clothing itself to give it a little bit more clarity. And we can even use this brush to apply some folds into the actual fabric. Now, the reason I like to do this instead of using the round brush is because there's just so much more control over this brush. Now, if I were to use the round brush to try to do that, you can see like I would have to go back in to tweak things quite a bit. But if I were to use the line brush, turn on pressure opacity, and we can just work that in there. We can use the blending brush to soften some of the edges. You know, pretty convincing render on the clothing. So once again, there's really no crazy tricks to doing a lot of these things. You just want to make sure that you're using the right kinds of brushes for these situations. And in the case of clothing, I prefer a sharper brush with a little bit more control. So let's say that about does it for our rendering. The final phase of this painting would be to apply a little bit of texture. And what I like to do, as you can see in the example here, is I like to just take a color, use the loose hatch slash rake brush and just apply some stylistic touches here and there. It doesn't really give you any new information, but it just, creates a little bit of interest in certain areas that could draw your attention and let your eyes linger for just a little bit longer. And I can even do this in the hair. So I can, add a little bit of that kind of following the direction of the hair. I can use the eraser and gently go back into it to make it fade into the rest of the hair. So in digital art, the eraser is really more of a brush than it is a tool that you use to remove mistakes that you've made. The eraser can actually create a lot of really interesting looks. So let's say if I were to apply the rake brush on the back there, now it's pretty jarring, but if I take the eraser and I gently fade this into the darkness, now there's a very nice, very coherent kind of look to that area. So the eraser, really valuable tool in your digital art toolkit. So that's that for this example. I actually kind of like how this painting turned out. Here, let's do a second one, okay? So this is an example of something that is a little bit more textured. Even though this is a bit more textured, we're following the exact same process. So for this piece, I started out with the Line 2.0 brush, turned on pressure opacity, so that when I'm sketching, the piece looks a little bit more loose, looks a little bit more rough, looks a little bit more like a traditional painting. When you want something with a little bit more texture, a little bit more of a painterly feel, you can afford to go a little bit looser. And in this case, I combined the use of the round brush along with some brushes that have a little bit of texture. So for example, the paintbrush sample down here, you could apply that right there to give the skin a little bit more of a textured feeling. And then you can take the color of the hair, smoothly blend that in there. And this really creates a different feel for the character in the painting. I'll go down here with some red. But really fundamentally, it's all the same concept. I'm still using the round brush category, which is a big brush that covers a lot of area, but just this brush has a little bit more texture. So it's the same brush categories, exact same thing. You use a line brush that has a little bit more control for the facial features, in areas where you need a little bit more clarity. And then on top of this is what's really fun about painterly paintings, that you could play around with some of the textures that you have. I could try to use a roller brush. I could try to use a paintbrush sample here to get a little bit more punch. Right, so something like that, again, we're still using the round brush category, just with a little bit more texture. But you also want to make sure that you don't apply every single texture there is on earth onto the painting, because that way you're gonna really overwhelm the viewer as well as the entire scene in the painting. I like to just keep it at about, maybe 4 to 5 different textures. If I want to add more, I have to make sure that it doesn't take away from the focal point of the actual painting. And you can use some more textured brushes to really carve out these shapes and really give it that rough kind of painterly look. So you kind of get what I'm talking about. It's just a bit of a different approach to the method that we outlined in our last example piece. But I also want to bring your guys' attention to this area right here. So you see that dark fade to the light. If you have areas like this that you want to create on your character, one method that works really well, and this is where the airbrush comes into play, is you can select it with the lasso tool and select the dark color. Now choose your airbrush, get it nice and large, and just brush it in nice and soft. And now you've got this really convincing look of fading dark to light, even in the ears here. If you have trouble fading things from dark to light, use the lasso tool and an airbrush, just like that. There's a highly three-dimensional kind of look to that area. The airbrush combined with the lasso tool, that's a combination of soft and hard edges, is really, really good for areas of ambient occlusion. Okay, this is a little tip to keep in mind. Now let's move on to backgrounds. Okay, it's actually a lot simpler than you guys might think. So let's take a look at this piece here. So it looks pretty complex. It might be kind of hard to grasp all the things happening in the background, but it's actually extremely simple, as I'm going to show you guys here. And we're going to take this color, I'm going to fill it with the paint bucket tool, and I'm going to try to replicate this pillar in the back here. Now, when it comes to backgrounds with a lot of man-made structures, the polygonal lasso tool in Photoshop is your best friend. And in Procreate, the lasso tool also allows you to create straight lines by clicking instead of dragging. I'm gonna find the shape that I want to paint. Now, what makes this really effective is, once again, the combination of hard and soft edges. So I'm gonna use the basic round brush. So obviously I cannot paint a perfectly straight line, but this lasso tool gives me that perfect straight edge. If you have a traditional painting background, this is something that works very similarly to, let's say, a masking tape that gives you a hard straight edge that you can then paint on top of. So I'm going to use the basic round brush, which is in the round brush category. That's good for painting large areas. I'm going to fill it with this color. When I deselect this, you can see there's a very sharp edge combined with a slight fade from the top to the bottom. And now you can see there's also this fade of a shadow in this portion of the pillar. How you're going to create that is using, once again, the lasso tool. It's extremely useful in the case of backgrounds. I'm going to take an airbrush, because the airbrush doesn't give me a whole lot of control, but it has a really nice soft fade. I'm going to take this airbrush and I'm just going to follow the selection right down. When I deselect it, now you see there's a nice sharp contrast between the light and the dark, which then fades back into the light. Now you're also going to see like some of these really rigid sharp lines. How that's done is with a line brush. So in this case, the No Mercy brush, which doesn't have too much variation. So I'm going to pick a darker color. In Photoshop, you can click a point, hold Shift, and then click a second point, and it drags a straight line right across that surface. And now you've got a little bit more of a detail in that area. And same thing for all these other lines, piping in the background. These are things that are quite clear. You want a lot of clarity to them. So when you do this, you want to click a point, hold Shift, click a second point, and now you've got this really nice straight line that's very clear. It reads really well. If the lightness or darkness is not to your liking, just use the airbrush and gently fade it out. You know, it's just a lot of this is playing around with the tools that you have at your disposal. And again, you know, looking at all these shapes in here, such as this triangle, the pillar over here, that's a combination of a round brush and the lasso tool. So is the chair here. Actually, this is a pretty interesting example. So let's say you want to draw that chair. Well, I'm going to outline the shape of that chair very roughly, and I'm going to fill it in with a color that I think represents the chair. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to take a airbrush, find a lighter color, and just brush it in really nice and gently from the bottom. Now it looks like there's reflected light coming from the bottom hitting that underside of the chair. Now moving on to the legs, we're going to use the No Mercy line brush once again, just to get that level of clarity. And then to get the reflections on the floor right there, all you need is the lasso tool and a soft edge created by the airbrush. It's actually really simple. So just like that, combining the lasso tool and the soft edge of the airbrush, and you can create something that looks very convincing. And at this point, we can even take a line brush, turn on the opacity, and just run it across the back of the chair to give it that slightly wooden kind of feeling. So adding in the details again, using that line brush. We can add the highlight to this side of the chair, to the rim of the chair, using that line brush for the maximum level of clarity. Even in the background here, you can see some of the things on the shelves. That's done with a No Mercy brush, without opacity, without any kind of, you know, detailed rendering. It's just very simple. It outlines the idea of the objects in the back, and it doesn't take your attention away from the main subject. And if this scene is a little bit more rugged, we probably would have used a more textured brush for this column instead of the basic round brush. But we can still add textures in the final phases of a painting, which let's take a scatter brush. I'm going to select this area, and I can take this darker color and I'm just going to lightly brush this onto the columns. Now when I deselect it, you can see there's a bit of a dirty feeling to the wall there. There's a little bit of ruggedness. So this is a pretty good look at how you can combine the brushes with the lasso tool to create some really really convincing and interesting looks. Moving on to the next piece, the sky. If you're drawing a sky, the airbrush is your best friend, okay? So filling it in with a single color. Then I'm gonna take an airbrush, I'm gonna make this really, really big. And I'm gonna take that color. So what you do is you just gently brush in the color that you want it to transition to, making the brush smaller as you go, just to get that fade from dark to light. And all of a sudden you've got a really convincing transition. You could even add some extra colors to give it a little bit more punch, right? Just like that, like under 30 seconds, super fast, gets you a very convincing looking sky. But on top of this sky, we've got some clouds. And this is interesting because like you would expect, you would be drawing these clouds with a round brush or any kind of flat brush with a little bit of texture that covers a large surface area, okay? So I'm doing it with just the basic round brush, just like that, okay? Now it doesn't really look exactly like the picture on the left, but here is where the eraser comes in. So when I turn on the pressure opacity on the eraser, I can erase back into my brush strokes to give it that really nice fade. Just like that. I'm gonna add a bit of a darker background to the bottom here. And fading it out a little bit, I can use an airbrush to soften that horizon line. So you see the power of that eraser and round brush combo in a softer environment like this. It's gonna be the same concept that we're gonna apply to that smoke, okay? So we're gonna turn on pressure opacity, twist the brush a little bit, and we're gonna follow the path of that smoke. Now you're gonna see that when I'm applying this, it doesn't necessarily look like the painting on the left. And that's because we haven't gone back in with an eraser yet. So when you take the eraser, carve back in to the shape that you've created, you can create a lot of very powerful variations between the thicks and the thins of the brush stroke that you're leaving behind. So you see, like, you can use the eraser to kind of fade things out. So the eraser, when it comes to digital art, is really not a tool to fix your mistakes, but it is more like a brush than anything else. And for things like lights that are out of focus, again, super simple, just using a round brush, you know, just dabbing it here and there, giving it slightly different colors, taking the color of the background, and then, you know, painting back into some of it, giving it a little bit more variation, and there's your lights out of focus kind of look. And then on top of all this, you see some stars in the sky. So I think I used the scatter brush a little bit, so you can apply a little bit of that here and there, and then using the eraser once again to take out some parts that you might not like, again fading everything out and blending it in smoothly with the background. So now there's like a hint of little dots of stars in the sky. And this part obviously counts towards the texturing phase of your painting. So using a texture brush, applying it over a surface to give it a different look. So that is a comprehensive look of how I break down my brushes, what kinds of brushes that I use for different areas of a painting and how I use them. And there are some really valuable tools like the eraser and the lasso tool that can be used in conjunction with these brushes to make your paintings really pop. Okay, so that's a walkthrough of when/how to use these different types of brushes and things you want to keep in mind as you're painting and rendering. Now in a second video, I'm going to talk about some of the Procreate alternatives that I use instead of some of the brushes that I have here, because not all of these work perfectly in Photoshop. So I'm going to go over that a little bit for the Procreate users here. And with that being said, that's pretty much it for this part of the tutorial. So thank you guys so much for your support. Thank you for being here. And I hope this was able to help you guys get a better understanding of the different types of brushes, the different characteristics of your brushes, and how/when to use all of these different brushes. And one final thing to remember is when I'm painting, I usually don't like to have too many different brushes used on the same painting. I think for the most part in my paintings, I use about 6-7 different brushes. I don't go into like 20-30 different brushes. There's just no need for that. There's no need to overwhelm yourself. I really do recommend just experimenting, trying things out. Find which ones you like, which ones give you a lot of control over your brush strokes, and find the ones that really give your paintings that personality that you're trying to convey. But yeah, things to keep in mind: the shape of the brush, the opacity of the brush, the control that you have over the brush, as well as the texture on the brush. And 5 different categories of brushes. There's a line brush, there's a round/painting brush, there's the airbrush, there's the blending brush, and there's the texture brush. So for the most part, these should all have a place in your digital painting process. Okay, that's it for this tutorial. Thank you guys so much for your support, and thank you for being here. Really appreciate you guys. I can't do any of this without your guys' help, so thank you so much, and I'll see you guys on the next tutorial, or in the Procreate section of this tutorial. Okay guys, welcome to the Procreate section for the brushes tutorial video. So as you guys know, not all of my Photoshop brushes transfer perfectly into Procreate. So I've been playing around with these brushes a little bit, and I've been finding some different alternatives for the ones that don't really work as well in Procreate. And following the same logic that I've outlined in the previous videos, all of these brushes are going to be working in pretty much the same way. So I'm going to go through them. I've adopted quite a few basic default Procreate brushes that work extremely well for my workflow. So the first one is the Technical Pencil. This is a really nice line brush. Let's go into the hair here. If you have this brush, it creates this really nice, this beautiful texture that almost resembles like a traditional pencil on paper kind of look, and I really like that about this. You can even shrink it a little bit, you could make it even darker, you could get some very sharp detailed lines with the use of this brush. Now the second brush that I want to introduce you guys to is the Reed brush. This is a really nice textured line brush. So I'm going to give you guys a demonstration here. If you take a look at the brush stroke, when I press hard, this is a very solid stroke with a decent amount of textures, but when I press lightly, there's a really nice kind of faded look to this brush, and I like that a lot. So when you're using this, it also works quite well for, you know, basic line work, just things that require a lot of clarity, a lot of control. You can get some really solid looking textures into the hair, into areas where you want a little bit more sharpness. So this one works beautifully along with the other brushes. And the third brush is the Syrup brush. This is kind of like a replacement for the Line Brush 2.0 that I have in my Photoshop brush pack, because the line brush doesn't work too well on Procreate because you can't really turn that brush, change the angles. So I've had to play around with a brush that kind of tapers, and I think this adjusted Syrup brush works fantastic for that. So let's say, for example, you want to paint the hair, you can apply a little bit of pressure and get that really beautiful taper into the dark sections of the hair, and then you can take the eraser. I'm using the basic round brush as a base for the eraser. It's just got a very nice fade. Now the Syrup brush works wonderfully for hair as well as for clothing, so it's kind of like a replacement for the Line Brush 2.0 that doesn't work super well in Procreate. And I've also been using it a lot for, you know, stuff like facial features, because it's got that sharp taper. It's able to really capture these very sharp and rigid shapes, such as the eyebrows, the eyes, nostrils, the line on the mouth, etc. Now moving down, the Line Brush 2.0 doesn't work too well, but the No Mercy brush, the airbrush, and the round brush, they all work perfectly as intended in Procreate. So you can use these the same way that you would as you see I do in Photoshop. Now, if you've been following me for a while, you know that the halftone brush doesn't really work in Procreate because it flattens the little round dots. But I found this Rosette brush to be a great alternative for that, because when you press really lightly, the dots on this brush actually appear smaller, and then when you press a little bit harder, the dots become much bigger. So this brush is in some ways a little bit more dynamic than the actual original halftone brush, and it's really great for applying textures onto your painting like the ones you see here. So that's a bit of an alternative. And then there's the loose hatch brush, which works pretty much as intended, and I think it works pretty well on Procreate as well. So I've been using that for my work. Now moving down to some of the texture brushes, the old brush is a really great solid round brush alternative that gives you a very distinct painterly kind of texture. So if you were going for something a little bit more traditional looking, a little bit more painterly looking, this is a really good way to go. The gouache brush is one of my favorites for applying a painterly underpainting. It has a little bit of texture, but it also gives you a whole lot of control over the colors that you're applying, the pressure that you're applying and all that. It really works quite well as a round brush alternative with a little bit more texture to it. Now the dry brush works great as a texture brush because it's got this nice rough kind of blend, very traditional looking. Turpentine is a fantastic brush if you were looking for a super painterly round brush alternative. I've adopted this into my brush pack and it works great for things like, environment pieces where you're gonna find a lot of really rough painterly surfaces and textures. So this one is wonderful for that. And once again, works really well as a round brush alternative for actually painting large flat areas. And the stucco is kind of in the same vein as that. Again, a very nice round brush alternative if you want a rougher kind of texture. And everything else in this brush pack pretty much work the same way. And I'm always playing around with these to make sure that they work and figure out some things that are working, some things that aren't working. So I'm going to keep you guys updated with this stuff. But the blending brush actually works perfectly in Procreate. So using the smudge tool in Procreate, if I were to just gently blend everything together, you can see it works in much the same way that it does in Photoshop. So that's really solid. I use it for skin a lot and it works wonders for me. And that's pretty much everything that I wanted to cover for this section of the video. So everything that I've mentioned here, all these brushes are going to be available to you guys as soon as the video drops so that you guys can have these brushes in your hands to play around with and see what works for you. And for me, now that I've gotten this brush set figured out, I don't really think there's anything else that I need in order to paint the way that I want to in Procreate. So this works really well for me. And I hope this brush pack works well for you guys too, along with the explanation of all the different types of brushes and my reasoning for when and how to use them. Hopefully this is going to be really helpful for you guys if you find yourself getting overwhelmed. But with that being said, I think that's pretty much it for our brushes tutorial for the month of July. I hope this has been helpful for you guys. Once again, thank you so much for your support. Thank you so much for being here. I really appreciate you guys. And that's pretty much it. Feel free to experiment a little bit. Remember to have fun with it. Find the brushes that work for you and have fun painting, guys. With that being said, I'll see you guys on the next tutorial.